think that's on. So, welcome everybody to another episode of the podcast. Today we're joined by Jeff. How are you doing?
Good.
Thank you
Great.
for thank you for joining us. Whereabouts of the states are you coming from?
Well, I'm near Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay, good stuff. I think that's the Washington DC has the highest average salary out of any state in America. You know.
It does. It's a lot of government workers and government contractors and people like that. So it actually is a pretty affluent area. However, when we
Yeah.
change administrations like we do now, a lot of people lose their jobs. So there's not a lot of job security. Every 4 years, sometimes things change.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild career to be in, really, anyway. But that's not really why we're here today. We're here today more to talk about sort of your career and your knowledge of sort of futurism and artificial intelligence.
Great.
So, how did you first get into it?
Well, as a child, I had two things that fascinated me. And the first one was medicine. When I was 7 years old and I had a little TV in my room, the only thing on TV at 6 in the morning was a medical seminar for doctors. And in fact, it was for surgeons and primarily neurosurgeons. So as I was getting dressed in the morning, I would watch this medical seminar and I didn't understand all of it, obviously. I didn't understand the terms entirely. But after watching it for over a year every morning, I got very fascinated with the brain and with some of the neurosurgery they were doing. So that was one of my areas of interest. And then as I got slightly older, I became fascinated with electricity and electronics because I asked my mom, I said, "Hey, mom, how does electricity make sound come out of the stereo, picture come out of the TV, light, mechanical motion? It operates the washing machine, the dryer, it creates heat for us." And I was fascinated that this one elemental force could do so much. So when I went to the university, my major was biomedical engineering. And my first project out of school was an implantable cerebrospinal fluid brain sensor. And it
Wow.
was really neat. It was a remotely monitored sensor for the pressure of the fluids in the brain. After that, I went into other fields, but they all involved to some extent human interface, how the brain worked. I was one of the very early people to design touch screens and actually the first building automation system for smart homes in the US.
Mm-hmm.
We became the largest selling uh, product in that
So,
type.
sorry, just to pause you a second.
Mhm.
What year was it that you first started designing and making touchscreens?
It was probably 1999,
Wow.
somewhere around there. Yeah,
And
very early.
yeah, for contrast, the first touchscreen with an Apple smartphone was 2007, I believe. So that,
Yes.
that that really is very early. Yeah.
That was an on-wall touchscreen. It was blue and white. We didn't have color. And then later on, we had something that looked a lot like an iPad, but we had no apps. And so it was commercially a failure because it couldn't do that much and it was very slow. But we were kind of well ahead of the game with that. And then I became the director of the Future Home Institute, which was designed to be a cutting edge, um, almost a living laboratory for a lot of these technologies.
When you say living, what do you mean by that?
Well, we had a person. An old house that was renovated with voice recognition and various sensor systems, touch screens, motion sensors. And we had a person live there 24/7 who was a person with quadriplegia to help test out how well these systems could work for people with disabilities, for frail elderly people. And so it was really more than just convenience. And so we really had a lot of success with it. We had publicity worldwide. The AARP publicized it. And then Occupational therapists used it thereafter as a lab to teach people how to use technology.
Oh wow. So this technology, in terms of scalability for quadriplegic, what sort of costs are we speaking to equip a house? It's in the same way that you described.
Well, back then was very expensive because all this was new technology and
Yeah.
much of it was not mature. Some was experimental. But these days, all the tools are there inexpensively. Google has their home product. There are plenty of smart light switches out there. There's geo fencing and other things. So these days, if you have an iPhone and some accessory products, you can probably outfit a home fairly inexpensively, for a couple of $1,000.
Hmm. Oh wow.
Back then, we spent about 500,000 outfitting the home.
Yeah. And this was the sort of late 90s.
Exactly.
Wow. So are you still in the space now? You used to be the director of the Future Home Institute. Do you still play a role in this, as you call it, this sort of cyber anthropology?
Right. I've actually moved on to carbon mitigation. My role now is I use AI and other technologies to help buildings be more energy efficient. So it's some of the similar technology because we're dealing with building automation, but the space I'm in now is primarily regarding energy efficiency and predicting buildings' energy use. We still use some AI, but it's a little different mission.
Okay. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit here. But so let's talk about the book you've written. Combines the sort of human brain and technology in this field, the cyber anthropology. So how is it that you combine these expertise? Is it similar to the sort of like Neuralink philosophy of, trying to sort of map the human brain and use technology to interact with it?
Well, it's not so similar to the Neuralink thing, but
Hmm.
what the book describes is that how human evolution is changing due to technology. So when we were cave people or early humans, our survival depended on our fitness. It depended on our smarts.
Mm.
It depended on our strength. It depended on our ability to attract a mate. And it wasn't so much about our survival, it was about our DNA's survival. So people would die off, but as long as their DNA continued forward, if it was quote superior DNA, we would evolve as a species.
Hmm.
But these days, you don't have to be smart. You don't have to be strong to survive. And with cosmetic surgery, you don't even have to be attractive to attract a mate. And so our technology these days has basically derailed the ancient concept of biological evolution. Now we're continuing to evolve as a society, but what is evolving is our technology, and AI is the biggest step or one of the biggest steps in that evolution.
Sure. Like on the evolving point, it's true. Like we don't need to be sort of physically strong and be able to fight like how we used to be. And also on that, I think I remember watching something about cars and how, the human body for us to be able to survive car crashes, it would take like thousands of years of evolution to survive high speed car crashes. But essentially, because we're very intelligent as a species, you know, the way we could adapt our environment and build things like technologically and engineering is sort of far faster rate than our bodies could sort of adapt to it, if that makes sense.
Exactly. That's exactly the point I'm trying to make. And the other part of it is that because these days in first world countries anyway,
Hmm.
practically everybody survives. Even if you have serious diseases, you can survive to reproduce. And people who would have died as children or people who would have died from diabetes or other things before they could reproduce are now able to survive. And the number of offspring we have these days is pretty much up to us. We have modern birth control and other methods, And so all those mechanisms that got us here from an evolutionary perspective are now gone.
Yeah, I mean it's scary. It's true actually. Just whilst you touched on birth rates, it's like, the UK, Italy, France, I definitely South Korea and Japan. They have basically non-sustainable birth rates, and it's fallen below the average of sort of 2.1 births per woman. So yeah, it's what you're seeing now. A lot of the sort of Western world are actually, yeah, populations sort of declining a bit because we're not sort of feeling the need to reproduce all the time. It's, I don't know, we just feel safer, I suppose.
Well, you're right, and that's one of the things I talk about in detail in my book is the declining birth rate, and some of that is through technology. For example, in 1960, the birth control pill was approved, and so since then, it's been easier for people to decide how many children they want to have. But the other thing is that the reproductive imperative, is what I call it, is diminished. So when you're in an ancient civilization, when you're scrapping for survival, you need to have children. First of all, many of them don't survive. Secondly, you need them to help you to find food and to make your household and your tribe work. You may need them as warriors. Having children was very useful in the ancient world.
Hmm.
And if you didn't have enough children, your tribe might not survive. So there was a reproductive imperative. But now that survival is guaranteed almost by technology, that reproductive imperative is going away. And so in the first world countries, and that's where you see this low birth rate, you don't see it in India or Africa or places like that, at least not to this extent. Despite the fact that the technology is available, people are having more children in third world countries than first world countries. Now, and I can see the graph on screen. If you want to tie this back also to brain development, the people who have very developed prefrontal lobes are
Hmm.
the people who think about the future implications of what they do. These are the people who think about the fact that going to college might pay off in the long run, even though it's very expensive and time consuming. These are the people that put away savings for their retirement. These are the people who are able to put off immediate gratification for future gains. And
Mm.
this is a relatively new development in the evolution of the human brain. It's still 20,000 years old, but this is our cerebral cortex and our prefrontal lobe. Ancient people were more midbrain oriented, and the midbrain is essentially the mammal brain, and it's very hormonally oriented and chemically oriented. The
Hmm.
very ancient people didn't plan things out to the extent that we're able to do it now. They didn't have the extent of language. They had some written communication and verbal communication, but certainly not what we have today. And so those people were not able to put their immediate gratification and immediate survival aside to plan well into the future because, as far as they were concerned, they might not have a very long future. But now we think differently. And so part of that is, do we really want to have a lot of children? So between not needing them to survive and a different way of thinking, because we don't are not concerned about our survival, the reproductive imperative is pretty much gone from these first world countries, as you showed on your graph.
Yeah, it's true. And also, I think societies like a cultural change as well. Something very noticeable. I was speaking with my grandmother recently, and she's 93. And when she was at the age of sort of 19, 20, thinking about a career, she went to a finishing school. Like the option of university really wasn't even there. So it's only really the last sort of 50, 60 years, especially in the United Kingdom, where the option of women to sort of fully go to university and fully embrace these careers and stuff has been sort of commonplace. Whereas for many hundreds of years before that, it really wasn't expected, or the woman didn't even get the choice really to go to university. So I'm sure that's played a role in the birth rates as well.
Well, it has. And I also, being a technologist and a futurist, I also um, attribute some of it to technology. So in the
Hmm.
1950s, right after World War II, we developed a lot of good technology for
Hmm.
the war,
Yeah.
but technology started to take off in the 1950s. First of all, medical technology, as I mentioned, the birth control pill, which is one thing that allowed women to enter the workforce and things like that. But other technologies, refrigeration, washers and dryers, cars in the US, in the 50s, we had an affluent society and a lot of good technology. So we had a lot of things in the home. Everybody had a refrigerator, they had a freezer, they had frozen food. They had TV tables and TV dinners. Women didn't have to stay home and spend their whole day cooking. We had supermarkets. We had cars to get you to the supermarkets. And a lot of homes had second cars back then, so the woman could do that. And so now it wasn't, women weren't required to help the family survive in the same way they used to be. When in the old days they had to go out and gather the food for the day and do all the things that needed to be done to keep the family healthy and strong. Now there was time available for women to go into the workforce, for women to advocate for themselves. The women's liberation movement wasn't too far behind with Gloria Steinem and many of the other women's liberation spokespeople. And
Hmm.
the other thing that wasn't far behind was the sexual revolution. And again, a lot of that can be attributed to the birth control technology as well as some of the other technologies that came out.
Yeah. Whilst you're talking about the women's rights movement, um, so I'm not sure what year it was in the US, but it's only been 100 years since the women have even had the right to vote in the UK. I think it's
Mhm,
around 1918.
mhm,
Yeah, I just finished reading this book on it recently, and it's Emmeline Pankhurst was one of the women at the forefront of it was called the suffragettes movement in the
mhm,
UK.
mhm,
And yeah, they used quite extreme tactics at the time, actually. They'd go on a hunger strike when they got arrested. They were sort of smashing up shop windows and stuff and doing pretty extreme protests. I mean, it's a bit off topic now, but we have these sort of environmental protests at the moment in the UK, sort of blocking motorways and roads and things. And at first, I was
mhm.
quite against it, but reflecting back on it, especially having learned what I've learned about the women's rights movement, I think, oh, actually, yeah, they are a bit extreme, but so were the women's rights movement back then. And I don't think anyone would argue that that was for the wrong reasons or that was bad, you know.
Well, what we have, and we had something similar in the US,
Hmm.
and I think it was just a couple of years earlier, but we have a change. And the change is that we are not strictly, as humans, here to reproduce. Most animals, including mammals, really have one mission, and that is to reproduce and make sure that their offspring are healthy. That's really what they're here for. And that causes their species to evolve. But because of technology and civilization, we now can serve multiple roles and we're aware of it. And so when you think about these various movements, if we were still in survival mode, these movements wouldn't happen. But we're not, and so now women can realize any career that a man could realize. The other thing is the way our brains work. So I mentioned the evolution and development of our cortex,
Hmm.
which is the heavy reasoning part of the brain. But
Yeah.
most mammals are ruled primarily by their midbrain. And the midbrain is chemically based, it's hormonal, it acts instantly. And it's these various neurotransmitter and hormones that make you feel the way you do. So those are the ones that respond immediately when you see an attractive person that you might want to mate with, or they respond immediately when there's food in the area, or you see some food you want to eat, or they respond immediately with your family by emitting
Mm.
oxytocin. and oxytocin is the love hormone, and or they respond with norepinephrine for flight or flight response. So if you see an enemy, but most animals are controlled through chemical hormone and neurotransmitter
Hmm.
emissions in the midbrain, and
Hmm.
humans continue to evolve past that, and we have the cortex, but there's a dynamic tension between the two. We often feel something at the gut level, which is the hormonal level, that we feel differently about at the logical level. So
So,
sometimes you have this
so
tension.
yeah. Sorry to pause you on that. Is that anything, when people say they have a gut feel, is that something to do with that?
Yeah,
Or
that's the midbrain, is the gut feel. You
wow.
can't explain why. And the midbrain is extremely smart. First of all, it got us to survive all these years. But the midbrain processes information differently, but it's very, very smart. Sometimes you just know something's not right.
Yeah.
Some people call it their spider sense if you followed Spider-Man, but you just know something's not right, even though your cortex, which is your planning, thinking, strategizing brain says, well, this is what I should do. The other part tells you no. And so it depends on which part of the brain most influences you. So people like engineers are generally more influenced by the logical part of the brain,
Hmm.
but many people are influenced by the other part. And so we see this in people. For example, in the United States, the Equal Rights Amendment has not passed. Even though women have the votes, there were many women opposed to that. And they stopped that constitutional amendment many years ago
Hmm.
because the hormonal part of their brain felt that there should be a special role for women. Even though the logical part said, well, women can do anything men can do. And similarly, when you look how people vote, and in the case of the US elections, we just elected
Hmm.
Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And many people will follow an alpha male. I feel like
Yeah.
Donald Trump is an alpha male in the old mold of the old kings, and
Hmm.
he even named his son Baron. And many of us are programmed through evolution, through our midbrains, to follow the tough alpha
Yeah.
male
It's
leader.
it's
They
sort of safe.
protect us.
Yeah,
Mhm,
safety and security. Is that
mhm.
why like women are attracted to, you see like a really muscular guy with big broad shoulders and stuff because it's kind of their gut feel. It says sort of safety to them.
Right. But then there's some women who are attracted these days to the software engineer because he's a guy who's going to have a steady income. So
Yeah.
if you're hormonally driven, and especially young people, young women and young men are often drawn to someone who's physically extremely attractive. But, there's countless stories of women who are going out with bad boys who treat them poorly,
Hmm.
but the hormones have dominated over the rational part of the brain. That prefrontal cortex doesn't fully form until you're about 26 years
25.
old.
Yeah, I thought it was
Yeah,
25, somewhere around there. Yeah.
I
And
guess it
isn't
depends on the person. Some of us,
isn't
it never actually happens, but
I think we all know people like that. And isn't the prefrontal cortex typically bigger in females compared to males on average?
I'm not sure about that. It certainly might be.
I think it might be.
And all these things I talk about function for the most part equally or more or less equally for both sexes. But this would explain why females go out with those bad boys until maybe they're 25 years old, and then they look for somebody who can have a steady job and support a family. And similarly, the men are attracted to very sexy women until they get to the age where they say, well, maybe I need someone who's going to be a good mom for my kids. So, but a lot of this is what is more dominant, hormonal midbrain or the cortex. I mean, look at how high school kids act, and it's very hormonal, right?
Yeah, well, super hormonal. When you're sort of 20-year-old males, some are pretty crazy. If I just share screen, 1 second.
Right, right.
There's here. Oh no, I've messed the. Sorry, I'll have to stop sharing. Right. We're gonna have to do an edit for these 10
Okay.
seconds. But basically, what I was trying to share screen and show you was an article saying, on average, females showed a greater volume in the prefrontal cortex of the brain in comparison to males. Said females had a greater volume in the prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, and superior temporal cortexes.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think you're probably right. I don't know that I would draw the conclusion from the size of the brain or the size of a particular area that females have more analytic capability than males. But
Hmm.
anatomically, I'm sure you're correct, because so much of it is how the area is exercised and neurotransmitter levels and what you've learned in life. But I will tell you that research indicates that men continue to be more mechanically oriented, um, more so than women. Now, whether that is genetic or the fact that they seem to play with mechanical toys, I'm not sure. But there's definitely differences between men and women, or it could be that their brain was bathed in testosterone while the women's were bathed in estrogen, and that makes some difference as to which part of the brains are more active.
Explain that point. What do you mean by that?
Well, men typically have different hormone levels than women. That's part of the thing that makes them men.
Oh,
And
yeah, yeah.
so men would have relatively high levels of testosterone. Now, females have some testosterone too, but the relative amounts are greater testosterone in men, greater estrogen in women. Now, remember, these hormones, while they promote sexual characteristics, also have various effects in the brain and interact with some of the other hormones. And so just having those hormone levels really makes a difference. When we were talking about alpha males, we were talking to some extent about the big tough alpha males. Well, alpha males typically have greater testosterone level than beta males or some of the other types of males. But
Mm.
interestingly, when people are promoted into a position of power, so let's say you get promoted in your job to a leadership role, they typically develop more
What? Oh,
testosterone.
wow. That
And women
that
also develop more testosterone
that's
if
some
promoted into
that's
leadership.
some tribe evolution type stuff then, isn't it, really? We have more power, like our brain's aware of it, and then it transcends into our body actually raising its testosterone levels just from the environment we're in at work. That's
Right.
fascinating.
Right. And your role in society, right? So
Yeah.
think about how useful this was when the alpha male of the tribe, think about Game of Thrones and the Jason Momoa character. He was like the ultimate alpha male. But they often got killed, right? Either in battle or the younger beta males would kill them and take their position, right? And once they were in that leadership position, they became, the meanest, not only the strongest, but they were mean. The way they took care of their enemies was to kill them typically. And interestingly enough, some of the Donald Trump behaviors about retribution on his enemies and things like that, again, mimic this classic alpha male behavior.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think he's an alpha male. It'd be interesting. He didn't release his medical records though, did he? But I bet he's got pretty high testosterone levels for a 76-year-old or however old he is. It would be interesting to
Yes.
know what his are. The thing is, though, I mean, this isn't an episode about politics,
Mhm.
but you know, I think as a leader, I think the leader of your country, he kind of needs to have a tough side to him because you're dealing with these other, you got your Putins, your Xi Jinpings, and you're dealing with some pretty difficult characters on the world stage. So I think, they need to be you do need a bit of that alpha male in them.
Well, apparently the American public agrees with you
Yeah.
because, and I'm not taking sides, but I'm just doing it from an academic perspective. But the knock on Joe Biden was that people felt he was weak. And, you know, people at a hormonal level don't look at policies and they don't look at economic numbers. they feel strong leader and they feel weak leader. And many people felt that Joe Biden was a weak leader. Although, when you look at the American economy, it's been pretty strong for his 4 years. But people make their decisions based on their gut. And
Sure.
and most people, that's how they work. And I think that's how this election worked. And so we can move on to AI and other things because you're right. This wasn't about politics, but it did just
Mm.
happen a couple of weeks ago.
But in terms of yeah, how people sort of vote with how they feel, I think there's been studies before about, better looking politicians and politicians with a deeper voice, etc., are far more likely to sort of have their confidence,
Hmm?
regardless of the policies and whatnot. And that is just very much the sort of
Right,
instinct type.
right. And I don't know how it is in the British Parliament, but in the US, if you look at our senators, they all, practically all of them, have a very full head of hair, at least
Yeah,
the men.
very good
There's very
looking.
few
Yeah,
bald
great
ones, good
teeth.
looking,
Yeah.
powerful, and that hair. I mean, they have this really thick mane, almost like a lion. And there's something to this. I mean, this is how we make our judgments on other people. The minute you see someone, your midbrain evaluates them. It doesn't take you more than a couple of seconds when you see somebody enter the room.
Yeah, it's true. Well, I think in the UK, we're sort of a bit more weird. It's not quite the case in terms of our politicians. We sort of vote them in all shapes and sizes. But I do listen to this UK political podcast, and someone used to be a member of parliament in the UK, and they did note how in the US they're all very good looking, sort of full head of hair, great teeth, etc. It plays a bigger role in the US politics than the British, I suppose. But yeah, anyway, enough of politics. Should we talk about some artificial intelligence then?
Of course.
Yeah, so explain your sort of experience and with artificial intelligence. Was it related to your career?
Well, I've used a fair amount of it in machine learning
Hmm.
because in the work I do, we have the ability to predict building performance based on some AI analysis. We learn how buildings work. We're able to predict how much energy buildings will use, when they'll use it, and therefore we can predict good ways to cut back on that energy use. So we use machine learning a fair amount. But I became very interested in the generative AI when it came out. And the reason was because generative AI uses theoretically the same type of neural networks that the brain uses. So
Mm,
there are mathematical representations of the neural networks that we have in our brain. And we now find that these neural networks can understand our language, can speak to us, can statistically make decisions that very much mimic the types of decisions that humans would make. And so what we've done is designed a digital version of a human neural network. And that's fabulous. I think that's a giant breakthrough because what we've already seen from AI is that it can outperform humans in many areas. While it has two big advantages over humans, and one is it's been trained with almost the entire internet, and so it has a much larger range of knowledge than the average human.
yeah.
And the other reason is that it works a lot faster than our brains. You know, we're using these massive supercomputers that NVIDIA makes,
Hmm.
and these GPUs are
Yeah.
three-dimensional array processors. And
Hmm.
our neural network in our head is essentially a three-dimensional array processor, but they work much faster than we can work. And so these
Hmm.
are two gigantic advantages. And how this now plays into evolution is that probably the last thing we had going for us to differentiate us from other people, since we don't have to fight or catch our own food, was how smart we were.
Yeah.
Well, now we have machines that are smarter than we are. And so, again, biological evolution, there's no need for superior brains to win out in the end when we have machines that are even much smarter than we are.
Yeah, exactly. The best example of an explanation for this I've heard was if you use the sort of the United Kingdom, for example, sort of 150 years ago, just over, the Industrial Revolution started. And, using the steam engine and using mass machinery to mass produce, and it took away a lot of the manual jobs. So, what the Industrial Revolution did was it took away the physical element. So humans then took up more jobs using sort of mental and their minds. However, I think the big worry now AI is here is if it's going for the sort of the work that humans use with their minds, what's left for us? And yeah, it's the next revolution.
That's exactly right. And the subtitle of my book is The Next Stage of American Society. Now, while it applies to most of the world, I wanted to keep it to America because, um, although I think your listeners would find it interesting, because America had so much technology, I sort of focused it on America. But it is the next step, and not only that, the professions that are affected by this are the professions that are known for their thinking. So, for example,
Hmm.
the medical profession. Um, AI will do a much better job on the average than your average doctor at diagnosing and prescribing. AI will do a much better job in writing text and copy than your average person. The advertising industry is going to be very affected and already is.
Hmm.
It'll do a great job in artwork. It'll do a great job in writing computer code. It does. It already does all these things. Well, these are high-end intellectual professions. And so AI is going to be displacing the people at the upper end of the intellectual spectrum first. And then when robots come out, which won't be too long, they'll be displacing people at the lower end who are doing the manual labor. And so any differentiation we've had in our ability to work longer, harder, smarter is going to be gone,
Yeah.
and we're all going to wind up being nodes on the network. Individual equal sort of equal nodes will take on more of a hive mentality than a hierarchical mentality based on certain people being superior to other people.
Yeah. I've kind of joked about this in the past that, if AI does turn bad, God forbid, maybe it will just keep some of like our best software engineers as like their slaves, kill everybody else.
Well, I was everybody was worried about AI. Isaac Asimov started way back when with the book I, Robot, where he put out his three rules to keep robots under control. Robots are really just AI with arms, right? And so people have been worried about this well before there were robots or AI. Look at um, the Terminator movies, so many
Hmm.
movies out there, even the latest Tom Cruise movie where AI is the bad guy.
Hmm.
But when you think about it, personally, I'm not concerned because I feel like AI is a tool that can be used for good or evil. The basic problem is that we have a lot of malicious humans in the world. And
Yeah.
while AI will enable them a little bit more, the source isn't the AI, it's the malicious humans.
Sorry to pause you. Just going back to Isaac Asimov's Three Laws of Robots. Was this in 1942 he first wrote it? Is that right?
He wrote the short stories in the 40s. I think the book called I, Robot
Wow.
was released in 1950. iRobot was a compendium of short robot stories that he wrote. And he was pretty amazingly prescient. His three laws were the
Hmm.
first one is that a robot may not injure a human being or through its
Hmm.
inaction allow a human to come to
To
harm.
become to harm. Yeah.
Right. The second was a robot must obey orders given to it by a human, except where such orders would violate the first law. And the third law was that a robot must protect its own existence as long as that doesn't violate the first two
First off.
laws.
Yep. And the movie with Will Smith in it, the iRobot movie, great movie by the way. The sort of the big twist in it is that one of these robots basically had been programmed and it had the option whether to obey those three laws or not, right?
Right.
And that's, I suppose, the big risk when you say about how, you have some insidious and not so good humans in the world. for example, I don't know if North Korea or China or whoever have the most dominant sort of AI supermodel in the world, then sort of where does that leave everybody else? You know, it may
Mhm.
not just be in terms of equality from a socioeconomic status. It could be all sorts of ways. Like I was listening to Elon Musk interview recently, and obviously, sort of the quotes misinformation or whatever they call it these days. Like it's a thing, but he thinks that one of the bigger risks, obviously you get these deep fakes, but one of the bigger risks is if you have these powerful like AI models influencing social media, is they could just tweak things like ever so slightly in like a less noticeable way, and people aren't, it's not so obtuse as like the deep fake that everybody sees. It's just very subtle. People aren't aware of it. He said that's a very
Right,
big danger as well.
right, right. So in the book Evolution Ended, I talk about what I consider to be the biggest danger from AI, and
Hmm.
that is when AI is legally given the status of a conscious being, and it will happen someday.
Hmm.
So back around World War II, there was a guy, Alan Turing, who helped the Allies break the Nazi codes. He was a famous mathematician. The movie Imitation Game's a great
Yeah,
movie that's
yeah,
about
it's
him.
a great movie. Yeah, I've watched that. Really is. Yeah.
And he was sort of the father of a lot of computer technology and also considered the father of AI. And he had a thought experiment. There was no AI back then, but his experiment was, how can we tell if eventually computers are thinking the way humans think? And
Hmm.
he came up with something called the Turing test.
Yeah,
And it's
I know
very
where this is
simple.
going. Yeah, I've heard the news of what's happened recently. I'll let you
And
continue though.
and the Turing test is when you have three entities in a room, and you don't know whether they're human or machine. So they would text back and forth. They wouldn't see each other, but they could use a computer terminal or text through the phone or whatever. And if you can't tell whether this entity is a machine or a human, and it turns out that it's a machine, if it can fool two humans in a very robust conversation, maybe you're talking politics or family or whatever, but if
Hmm.
it can fool the humans, then it's said to have passed the Turing test. So we're at that point now where it can be said some people are claiming that the Turing test has been passed, others
Yeah.
claim it hasn't, but we're really close. In any case, it will happen soon if it hasn't. Now, if someone goes to court, and I'll give you an example. Let's say we have an AI avatar that is our grandma, and it is learned through looking at grandma's Facebook and videos to talk and act and
Imitate.
look just like her on screen. And my children enjoy interacting with grandma. Okay. Um, Now somebody wants to turn grandma off. And one of the people says, I love grandma, you'd be killing her. And it goes to court. And the court has to decide whether you can unplug this AI avatar. Well, if it's passed the Turing test, why would it be considered anything other than human? And would you be able to unplug it? Wouldn't that be tantamount to murder? And so when the courts find that the Turing test has been passed and some smart lawyer says, well, this is a living thing, this is a sentient being, then we might not be able to turn it off. And if we're
Right.
legally not allowed to turn AI off, it opens up an entire can of worms.
That's true. But it could still, like, if it's a sentient being, like an electronic sentient being, that could still be different to its technically being a human, right?
Absolutely, but we give animals a lot of rights these days. We
Mm.
wouldn't go out and kill a dolphin.
Well,
So how could we be allowed to kill this being?
yeah, no, no, it's a very good ethical point. Sounds a bit random, but it is connected. So it was somewhere in Europe. There's octopus. So people eat octopus in Europe. I don't know if they do in America. They have it with like their pastas and things.
Mhm,
So there was a lot of protests and it was big debate over whether they can farm octopus, grow them to kill them and eat them for restaurants
mhm.
and stuff because they're highly intelligent and they're basically not sentient, but how intelligent they are. That's causing all these ethical debates for these octopus farms for rearing them for food. So it would be a sort of similar model of ethical debate, I suppose. It does pose a really good question, doesn't it? But the point at which AI is sentient, I mean, it can't be that far away.
Right.
Like people, you have, is it Moore's law, where computing power doubles once every 2 years? But from what I've been looking at, AI is way faster than this, the speed at which it progresses. Is that accurate?
I believe so. It's yeah, Moore's law. The AI is not necessarily dependent on the speed of the computer, and you're right, it's evolving, for lack of a better term, much more quickly. And interestingly, if we right now we're training AI with data and digital images. What if you trained AI with the life experience that you and I would have? So let's say you took a person when they were a baby and put tons of sensors on them and let them go through their daily lives and got the hugs from their parents and fought with their siblings and went out and rode their bike and did all these things. If you trained AI with that data set, would it then have the emotions of a human? Would it have the sentient feelings of a human? Would it function just like a human? We don't know, but I think that's an interesting experiment, right?
Yeah, that is a very interesting experiment. And similarly, this is one of the concerns I have is okay, these AI sort of large language models that they're trained from sort of scraping the internet, all this data off the internet. But as
Right.
we all know, what conversations and the way humans interact, sorry, on Twitter and these social media is not the same as the real world. I think that big difference in how
Hmm.
AI is just going to where it's getting its data from is, yeah, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, there's a ton of implications. I mean, the world is going to change dramatically and quickly. Think about, some other things. If AI's passed the Turing test, will we have to start paying it wages, or are we going to keep it as a slave? Um, are we going to have to give it a break from work? Are we going to have to let it join the union? Is it going to be allowed to own businesses? Can you leave it your money in the will, or can you make it the administrator of your business? There's so many legal concerns. Once it passes the threshold of having human-like status in the legal system, it's mind-boggling to me.
No, likewise, it's scary and yeah, it really is shocking. So I'm gonna see if I can share screen again to show you. Okay, Haroon, if you're still there, can you try and find this article? There's a Reuters article. Open AI researchers warned board of AI breakthrough ahead of CEO ousting. So, are you aware of OpenAI in the United States?
Oh, sure. Mhm.
Yeah. So, do you remember what happened when CEO Sam Altman, he was sort of ousted from the company and then came back again in 2023,
Mhm.
and it was under very strange circumstances. So there's rumors, and in fact, I think it was Reuters ran some articles talking about how the OpenAI engineers basically were raising concerns that it was something wild, like humanity changing discoveries or something had been
Mhm.
taking place.
Mhm.
Okay, let's see what he's got here. OpenAI, Sam Altman's 4 days in exile. Several staff researchers wrote a letter to the board of directors warning of a powerful artificial intelligence discovery that they said could threaten humanity. Two people familiar with the matter told Reuters. This was back in November 2023. And I think yeah, that is just two people within one company. But I think one of the Google engineers left as well, saying
Mhm.
basically worrying about the level of sort of sentient being that their AI is it deep ch sort of chat model had got to.
Mhm.
So yeah, And knowing, the rate of the AI, how it is developing, even just from using sort of chat GBT compared to sort of a couple of years ago, it can't be long. Within the next 10 years, surely we're going to have
Oh, surely.
some sort
Yeah.
of super sentient AI. Just, and who owns it? Probably a private company. I know in the US there was that letter that many people signed to sort of it pushing for a better regulation on AI, wasn't it?
Right.
Uh,
And Jeffrey Hinton just won the Nobel Prize as one of the fathers of AI.
hmm Scroll down a bit, Harry. Yeah. Jeffrey Hinton, 75, announced his resignation from Google in a statement to the New York Times, saying he now regretted his work. He told the BBC some of the dangers of AI chatbots were quite scary. Right now, they're not more intelligent than us, but I think they may soon be. And yeah, it's like you're using ChatGPT or something, and
Mhm.
it could write sort of like a world-class poem in less than a minute. It's the power is really scary. And I think the worry I have with it is, yeah, the level of risk, and governments are slow to move, right? Everybody
Mhm.
knows that. Governments are not
Mhm.
fast, efficient machines. And whether we can regulate it in the right way quickly enough, I think is one of the biggest threats we sort of face.
I don't think we're going to be able to regulate it because, um, let's say, now the EU has come up with some guidelines. The Biden administration had some guidelines, but I think Trump's going to loosen them up. But there are so AI can be created in a small office space by anybody who's got a couple of talented engineers. And it's almost impossible to regulate. There's no external signs that it's happening or anything like that. Even if we regulate it successfully in Europe and the US, there are third party actors in North Korea, China, Russia, other places where these regulations won't apply
hmm
and it will get out. And so I think the likelihood of success in regulating something like this is tiny. It's very small. And I think we need to move as quickly as possible so that we can use AI for defensive reasons as well. We don't want someone in Russia or North Korea developing an AI agent that can infest our financial system and transfer all of our wealth to North Korea. What we want to do is stay at the forefront so that we can build defensive systems with powerful AI to help mitigate the effects of people who are using AI for harm. But if we limit ourselves too much, we won't have those defensive AI weapons available to us. It's kind of an arms race at this point, and just like the nuclear race, we sort of have to stay on top of our game.
Sure. So we can't allow the regulation to slow us down too much and give them this big advantage.
Right.
So it just kind of goes down to hoping the sort of ethics and the morals of those who are creating it are similar to that of Isaac with his sort of three laws. It's really what we have to sort of trust in people. And I think now you've got XAI as a sort of competitor to Google and ChatGPT as well, I think is good. I think it's good to have this competition. Yeah, but not just from like an arms race perspective, from a defense, although like an economic, the inequality in the world is already pretty extreme still. A lot of the world, I think, is if you're the top 1% earner in the world, if you're on $30,000. So it sort of puts it to contrast. But if US or a country like that does develop, surely they could build a sort of wealth accumulating machine
Hmm.
just at a
Hmm.
rate that no one else has ever seen, and then
Hmm.
it could just sort of become like this monopoly, right? Is
Right.
that not
Right. No, no,
yeah.
it could be. I mean, if it's applied properly to the stock market, it could be very powerful. And, in other things like Bitcoin, things like that, it could prove to be very powerful. The other interesting thing, and I want to bring this a little bit full circle, is that earlier we talked about the fact that the population of the first world countries is diminishing, that the birth rates are well below replacement rates.
Yeah,
And normally that would lead in the old days to economic collapse. But because we now have these AI tools, soon to be robots, but AI tools, including robo taxis and things like that, we won't need as many people in the labor force as we used to have to maintain our level of prosperity.
yeah.
So AI is actually going to come to the rescue vis-a-vis these declining birth rates and allow us to continue to have prosperous societies even with fewer people.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to build on that point, from like an economic perspective, obviously the sort of level how skilled your labor force is dictates the economy a lot as well. But the actual size of the labor, so the Indian economy is starting to boom now, and it's going to be one of the
Mhm,
next world superpowers because their level of education's increased, but also
mhm.
they've got a huge workforce of sort of working age people now, and they're at that sort of level of education. So that's sort of typically how it's always been. But now, yeah, you're right, with the AI and automation and robots. So I'm a bit of an Elon Musk fanboy, if you haven't picked it up already listening to this episode. But Elon thinks that in the future, Tesla is going to sell more robots than cars.
Mhm.
That's what he believes. And the way he was breaking it down, he was saying, if you can sell one of these Tesla robots for sort of 25, $30,000, right, and it lasts 10 years, right, a company has that. That's sort of $3,000 a year that company is now having to pay versus if they had to employ a human over the same time period of sort of $300,000 or $30,000 a year, $300,000 over those 10 years. So he thinks that this could like dramatically reduce the cost of goods and services in the future. Yeah.
Right. No, I think he's right. Am I still on video?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. Yeah, no, he's right. Everything, and this is the reason I wrote this book, because everything is already changing. Everything is going to change. Um, in so many ways, people might not leave their homes with climate change. When the climate starts to really get bad, they might stay home. They might have their AI avatars and robots go out and do things for them. Physically, who knows what it's going to do to them? But there's no reason for people to be fit anymore. It's really, really changed everything.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I'm glad I spent the time talking to you because I try and keep on top of it. But the reality is, most of us are very busy, working on normal jobs in our everyday lives. We occasionally see news articles pop up. But meanwhile, in the background, some of the biggest companies in the world are investing billions and billions and billions into this. And, the rate of growth is just insane. But one of the things I think in the sort of short term that might restrict it is the literally the data, the energy that the data requires and these power sources, right? I know Facebook are looking at acquiring, I think, sort of old nuclear power stations and stuff because
Mhm.
these big AI models, these big data centers require huge amounts of energy, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a huge problem. Virginia in the United States, which is just south of Washington, D.C., was the home of a lot of data centers. They're essentially out of power now. Um, we're
Really?
not we're not building any more coal plants, for environmental reasons. Wind and solar are both unreliable.
Yeah.
They can certainly provide power on sunny days, but uh, we don't have that many sunny days, especially in the winter when the days are short. And so we're probably going to wind up going back to nuclear, and these data centers are some of the first ones who are probably going to use it. And
Hmm.
because we just don't have enough power. Then if you add electric vehicles to the load, and
Yeah.
then you add to the fact that we're pulling the old coal plants are being pulled offline, and so the generation is diminishing while the load is increasing, we are very soon going to have a power crisis in the US.
Yeah, I imagine the UK is in a similar situation. So this article we've got here, the boom in artificial intelligence and quantum computing will drive a spike in energy use, the national grid has predicted. Chief Executive John Pettigrew said the power those data centers would use will increase sixfold in the next decade. So that's 600% in the next 10 years, saying the grid was becoming constrained and bold action was needed to create a network able to cope with this dramatically growing demand. Yeah, that's pretty much what you're saying. For the UK, it's we're in exactly the same situation, which is
Right.
interesting. Now, I mean, it won't look great and it'll be hard to win support, but if they did burn more fossil fuels to get these data centers up and stuff, would the AI or the quantum computing have the ability to sort of solve these complex problems like global climate change? It's a bit
Well,
of a risk,
actually,
but
I think we have the answers. And you know, when you think about it,
yeah,
humans are pretty good at solving problems. Look at all we've accomplished, especially from a technology perspective. So it's not like humans don't know anything. Now, I think AI can add a lot in certain areas, medical research, protein design, things like that. But we kind of know the answers. We just have social issues that prevent them from happening. So nuclear can do everything we need it to do, but there's social resistance, especially, for example, years ago in Germany, they got rid of all the nukes. And so we as the power industry understands that where they have to go with this. And the answer is primarily nuclear and storage. We have to get battery technology that can help store energy when we don't have a peak load. But the problem is society's appetite for adopting technology like nuclear that may scare them a little bit.
yeah,
And so years ago
previous
we
disasters. Yeah.
stopped doing nuclear because of societal issues, not because of technical issues.
Well, I think haven't Germany, even the last couple of years, they've been closing down more of their nuclear power stations, haven't they? Which does seem a bit of an odd decision. But I suppose if a lot of your sort of voting age base of the population are sort of 50 years old and whatnot, they remember all of these disasters, famous ones. So yeah, it's just people, I guess, the sort of animal mid part of their brain thinking of the danger more than the logical, isn't
Right,
it?
right. They see pictures of atomic blasts. Now, in the US, as far as I know, no one's ever been killed from a nuclear power plant. Now, of course, Chernobyl was different, but you know, the Russian people don't really care too much about their population. But you know, we have better designs now. The plant that powers most of our electricity where I live has been running now for about 50 years without incident. And um, a lot of it is just the public's appetite for these things. But in truth, if we want to have our AI and our and electric vehicles and our televisions, there really isn't much other choice. Now, people were hoping fusion would happen, and while we have reached break even, it will probably be 50 years before we get fusion that's operational. We just can't wait that long.
Yeah. So, a nuclear fusion, that has the potential for just the power, just insane power from tiny, tiny, tiny amounts. Like you're talking grams could power
Mhm.
sort of
Right,
ships and stuff, couldn't you?
right.
But yeah,
But it
yeah,
could blow up
they
too,
always,
right?
yeah, they always seem to be on the edge of a breakthrough with fusion, don't they? And they sort of have been for the last decade or so without actual. But yeah, it seems it's like it's almost a miracle solution, isn't it? But like you said, how long away that is.
Well, right, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. So while it's not radioactive, the immense power could create a danger. containing that type of heat is a really difficult thing. And it doesn't mean it's safe just because it's not radioactive. It doesn't mean that they couldn't have some kind of a meltdown or a huge fire or something else. So but we just don't have the time to wait for the future. We have to address these problems within the next 5 years. And it takes a nuclear power plant would take probably 20 years between the time it was proposed, approved, and ready to be operational. It takes a very long time. And we have these small nuclear plants now that are
Hmm.
coming online
Is
that
that
could be a lot quicker, and that might be a help.
Yeah, I think Rolls-Royce in the UK are trying to develop. Is it small modular nuclear reactors or something?
Right. And think about a U.S. submarine or aircraft carrier that has had nuclear power for 40 years right now and no accidents. They haven't needed to be refueled yet, although it's probably coming up. And it fits in the space of a submarine. So it can certainly be done, right?
Yeah, well, that's the amazing thing. These nuclear powered submarines, in theory, they could just stay down there for years, but they're just limited by how much food they can take on.
Hmm. Hmm.
It is incredible, isn't it? And we kind of
Right.
forget. And
Right.
even don't you have US have nuclear powered aircraft carrier as well, right?
Exactly. And they could go for years. An aircraft carrier could go for years and years. And the next thing that we're talking about, so I work with large utility companies, is having these small modular nukes on our military bases. And there's two good reasons for that, or three. And one of them is that if it's on a military base, the neighbors don't get a say into whether it goes there or not. They can't really protest. The second one is resiliency. You want your military to not lose power and lose
Hmm.
effectiveness. And so that's very important. And the third thing is that it can unload the grid. So right now, the military is using the same power as our cities and such, but if they have their own generation, that would allow more power for the civilian population.
Yeah. Also leaves them somewhat vulnerable as well, right? I'm sure they have
Mhm.
backup generators, but still.
Right, but they use diesel fuel. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's interesting stuff. I think we're right to wrap up, if that's okay with you. It's quite late here in the UK now. It's sort of 10:30. But thank you very much for coming on, Jeff. You've been very interesting to talk to. You've made me think about AI and the future quite a lot. So, last question, I suppose. Is the AI going to be good or bad for humanity in the future?
My personal opinion is it's going to be overwhelmingly good. Um, you look at the Industrial Revolution, for example.
Hmm.
And while people lost some jobs and things happened and there was some abuses, it was overwhelmingly good. If you look at the internet, which is probably the next huge giant thing, and yes, there's social media and there's misinformation, but overwhelmingly good. And I think AI is going to be the same. Just yes, there's going to be some things that aren't perfect, but overwhelmingly a big advance for humanity.
No, that's good. I think I'm somewhat more pessimistic than you in that regard. But I think it's probably the biggest invention humanity's ever seen because quite soon, I suppose for the first time in our history, we're not going to be the most intelligent species. And I think that it just makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. Hopefully, it has a lot more empathy than humans and treats treats us well and everything else well. But yeah, no, that's brilliant. You have given me a bit more confidence actually, though, a bit more optimistic about the AI in the future, having spoken to you. But do you want to tell people your book for the last time?
Sure. It's called Evolution Ended. It's available on Amazon. It's my name is J Jerome. You can Google me up under J period Jerome. I have a website, jjjerome.com. You can find me on Twitter, or X is what they call it now. And so take a look at it. I think it's a lot of thought-provoking topics that we should all be thinking about because humanity's changing and we can't stop it. So we sort of need to know where we're heading.
Okay, evolution ended, the next stage of the American society. You heard it, folks, and thanks very much again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise, cheers.